So welcome. This is the first of three videos we'll be doing coming up in the next few weeks here. Introducing folks, talking a bit about this practice of silvopasture. It's sort of unofficially the launch of the release of my new book, which was the work of many people, many hands, many thinking, much thinking, lots of research, all those kind of things. My role in this was really the librarian, was the curator, to kind of bring together the research and the anecdotal information as best I could and try to articulate what we do know and what we don't know about this practice. So I lean on the shoulders and the brains of many other people in this endeavor. There was over 300 references in the book, and that's a testament to hundreds of people's devoted effort to better understanding this. So give appreciation to those folks from the outset as we go. I'm going to start off and give a little background and some information about silvopasture, and then we'll turn it over to Brett, who can share a bit about his farm. And as I said previously, we'll record this and post it on the silvopasturebook.com website for other folks to access as we go. So let's get started here. Let me just reorient myself. I want a presence from the outset where we are, where I am at least, where I'm coming from. No matter where you are in the world, you're sitting on land, even if it feels like you're several floors or there's a big concrete slab or something in between you and the ground. We're on land, and land has a long and storied history. And for me, as a farmer and as an educator, it's always important to acknowledge the land that I'm on and where I come from. And it's not just the English names or the settler colonizer names that have been given, but also the territories of Native people who've been here much longer and still persist today. So I'm broadcasting today from the Cayuga Nation land, which is part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And I encourage you, as someone who lives on land somewhere, to get to know what Native folks live and have traditionally lived on the land that you're on. And there's a nice link there at the bottom of the screen to find that out. Really nice map where you can put in your address and then learn a little bit more about the folks that have been there for a long time. I'm going to throw out a bunch of books during this and resources for further reading, further research. One in relation to this area where we'll start is a really great read, Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. So I really recommend that. As we're farming, we're certainly working with landscapes, and it's, I think, important to understand both the recent and the long history of the places that we live today. This book was really, as I said at the outset, an effort to pull together lots of research and understanding, and to acknowledge both what we know and we don't know about the practice of silvopasture. These are the chapter outlines. This book is going to be released in early June by Chelsea Green Publishing. So I'm really excited to have that as a companion to Farming the Woods, which is a book I worked on with Ken Mudge, who's retired from Cornell, which articulated the practice of forest farming. So these are all agroforestry practices, and agroforestry is really any type of farming that combines trees or forests and crop production. So forest farming is really everything in the woods, in the existing woods. We did touch on animals briefly, but really acknowledged that silvopasture is its own specific practice and really needed its own book. So this was my attempt to bring all those kind of things together. And I'll just do a little pitch from the outset. I do have a Kickstarter going right now. You can find a link to that on our book website. Click through to that. We're doing really well. I really appreciate if you've been a contributor or considering it. I really appreciate the support. Writing a book is certainly not a way to make turn a good profit by any means. It's certainly a labor of love, and it's something that I value and put into the community, partially because I've benefited from when other people do that. Other books and papers and speakers and educators have brought me to where I am today. So the goal of the Kickstarter is to help support contributors to the book. We had a number of farmers and practitioners and researchers contribute excerpts, so I want to support their work. I do want to catalog the many references and free PDFs and links in an easy to use, easy to access format. And I have other people who are more computer savvy than I who can help with that. but it takes some time and energy and some resources to organize so that you can find, if you're interested in tree fodders, let's say, or you're interested more in what we know about pigs in silvopasture. We want to organize the resources that are kind of spread all over the place. And so really excited to announce with this campaign that I had an anonymous donor contact me and say that they would match any contributions I got from now through March 8th. So they'll do a 2-to-1 match. So if you give $20, they'll give $40. So it's a great incentive, and appreciate you considering contributing if you haven't already. And if you have, I really appreciate the support of this project, which is a collective effort. So any questions about that, you can get in touch with me, but that's the deal. And I'm really grateful to this anonymous donor, who obviously will remain nameless, for their support as well. So that's my pitch. Let's get into the presentation here. Really where I come from is this deeper understanding of history of land use, especially in North America and the US, which really starts off much before this image is depicting. We can talk, and the book does talk about Native American land use and how that changed once colonization started to ravage the landscape here. And so there's a lot of pieces, but I think one of the biggest ones that I want to draw out right now is this idea of the forest sort of being in the way, or being a wasteland, and that agriculture in the mind of many European settlers looked like open fields and plowed fields devoid of forests. And so we have that in our history, and it sort of trickles into much of today and what we're working with when we think about agricultural landscapes. I really recommend this book as a resource, Changes in the Land. It really articulates well this sort of history and the attitudes and perspectives of both Native peoples in New England, as well as colonizer settlers, and looks at the relationship of that to the landscapes that we see today. And if you're not aware, if we're on a landscape today, we're pretty much in a space that has been pretty heavily manipulated, and most often is a space that's been cleared entirely of forest in some relatively recent history, in the last 100 years, in the last 200 years at least. So we don't really even we can't fully appreciate what sort of older forests, what sort of older ecotypes have been, because there's just been such a big footprint on the landscape. And this is something that really continues today when we look at farms, and the attitude often of crop agriculture is that trees and woody materials in the way, and this is something to get out of the way as quickly as possible. And this can have a lot of negative effects. I notice on our road, as more folks are clearing hedgerows and making it easier for their tractors, I understand that need, but it also creates a lot more turbulent winds, and it also blows a lot more snow across the road. So we're losing these things, and it continues to be some of the prevailing opinions. And sometimes when folks first purchase a piece of property, they say, well, the easy thing I can do is kind of rip out this vegetation, rip out this material. But there is some value to that. And the next webinar is going to talk about climate change, and I'm going to address that specifically with our farm, and how we've actually really shifted our perspective, and how we've thought about invasive brush and these kind of things as part of a transition to a more holistic landscape. So, in the meantime, as we've removed woody plants from the landscape, removed forests, we've perpetuated that kind of idea. We've also removed animals from the landscape, and I'm sure this isn't foreign to most folks in the room here, but if you're eating meat, it's most likely coming from this kind of scenario, where we have a confinement operation where the food is brought to the animal, rather than the animal being allowed to explore and discover its own food and live a much more pastoral existence compared to this kind of thing. So about 2% of meat right now is grass-fed, is pastured in the US anyway, so it's a very small percentage. But the demand is actually doubling each year. So there's a huge interest. Consumers want to see and want to get, they want to see their animals on pasture. They want to support farmers that are doing that work. And so there's a great incentive and a great possibility. And so there's a vision here in my mind, which is really rebuilding ecosystems, really thinking about embedding livestock in the landscape as productive members of that landscape. They're doing brush clearing work. They're doing fertilization work. They're doing grassland management work. They're doing forestry work in some ways, pruning more specifically, and things like that. So here's our sheep on our farm in a silvopasture where we've planted black locust and willow, two of the top species I really recommend and interested in, and think folks should consider planting if they're interested in that angle. And we'll talk again more about that in the third webinar, which is about tree fodders. But This is a habitat that's really wonderful for the animals. It's fun to watch them explore, and at the end of the day, that's a really good measure of success when you see the curiosity and the enjoyment of the animals in the farm landscape. So I'm going to define silvopasture in three very long, grammatically incorrect run-on sentences to kind of give you a sense of what I think some of the key pieces are. And of course, Brett, I'm sure will elaborate or agree or disagree as we go along here. There's a lot of nuance to this. And, you know, I've for years been an instructor and taught a lot of folks about mushroom cultivation. And that's a good contrast, because teaching folks how to grow mushrooms, there's a lot of kind of recipes. There's a lot of really clear directives of, well, if you do this and then you do this, you're going to get this result. Silvopasture is very much a context specific and a very dynamic and very site-specific endeavor. So there's a lot of different ways you can go, and that's a great thing, but it's also challenging to really define and create parameters. So the way I like to define silvopasture, and silvo being coming from silvics, which is the study and exploration of trees and forest dynamics, pasture obviously being from grazing. So we're looking at something that's intentional. So the intentional combination of trees, domesticated animals, and forages as something that's multi-layered. So we're thinking about all those layers at once, where each of these parts benefits the other from this interaction. So it is not a system that just benefits the animal. It also needs to benefit native grasses, native forbs, forages, and also the trees at the same time. And the benefit to the farmer being that multiple yields are harvested from that same piece of land. On another lens, silvopasture is clearly one of the best approaches to regenerative farming. And this is kind of a hot phrase now. It used to be sustainable ag. Now regenerative farming is seeming to show up more and more in conversation. And this idea that, you know, our farm landscapes are pretty degraded and that our practices need to be regenerative in the sense that they build more ecological wealth instead of just sustaining something, because what we can sustain right now is a pretty low level of biological health anyway. So it is really, I would definitely make the argument it's one of the best approaches on a broad acre, affecting the most amount of acres. It can do a lot to restore soil health and habitat. And it's been shown to sequester the highest amount of carbon of any agricultural production system. And that last phrase is really key. And Eric Toensmeyer is going to present in the next webinar this coming Monday about this. But I think this is really important. If you're not familiar with the publication Drawdown, it is a New York Times bestseller. It was a research attempt by a wide group of researchers and scientists who were looking at the question of global warming, and what they wanted to do is develop a plan. Like, what can we actually do to solve this problem of global warming? So they were looking at the effects on greenhouse gas emissions and on carbon sequestration. So what are the actual activities we can engage in? And agroforestry does quite well. You can see here they basically ranked the top 100 solutions. And silvopasture played out very well. It ranked number 9, and it ranked above regenerative agriculture as a whole. And it's the highest ranked agricultural solution to climate change. So, of course, we're not going to find a silver bullet here to address this really complex and multifaceted problem. But silvopasture shows up really prominently, and I think it's an important piece to this puzzle. And I'll allow Eric to really elaborate on that next week in the next webinar. And I think it's important, you know, the kind of broader implications are really important, but at the end of the day, when we work with farmers, we messed up the slides here a little bit. Oh no, I didn't. Here, let me go back to this one. So part of the reason silvopasture ranks so high is as compared to even, I'm not sure if I put it on here, but no, like managed grazing does pretty well in this, but it's much lower than silvopasture. Silvopasture systems tend to sequester 2 to 3 times the carbon of just managed grazing systems. And it's really because the trees add a lot of carbon storage. This is an image that is from a pretty old paper. It's really looking at carbon, where it shows up in soil prairies. So I don't want anyone to take this as a blanket analysis for all ecosystems. And I think that's a really important thing to highlight. We can apply silvopasture on a wide range of contexts, but the implications are going to be very specific to the type of ecosystem you're working in. But we can kind of deduce some general patterns from this. And what I want to show here is, if you look on the left there, it's an analysis of where carbon is stored. If we look at a forest system, we see 90 out of the 167 tons being stored in the standing trees, and then a smaller percentage of the tree being, of course, still in the soil and in the roots. And then you see with the prairie, the opposite, where you have most of it stored in the below ground, the soil layer, and very little in the upper vegetation. And so silvopasture, by mixing the trees and the really established forages, has that potential to sequester the most amount of carbon. And so that's really kind of the basics of where that comes from. Now, again, lots of nuance. So sequestering carbon, the potential of an ecosystem to pull carbon and put it in the soil or put it into wood is not the same as how long it can actually hold on to that carbon. And so different soil types, different biomes, different ecosystems are all going to have different rates. But kind of the general pattern here does apply across context. So the third thing, these bigger implications are important, but at the end of the day, I know myself, I'm a farmer, you know, I want to do good for the climate. I want to think about these bigger problems. At the end of the day, I also have to think about sort of our farm and our situation, and I have to make it work. And this is one of the big challenges with agroforestry, is sometimes the barriers to adoption are around some of the challenges of cost and time and not seeing necessarily those returns right away. Although I do see the potential with certain tree species to have pretty quick returns on investment. So in terms of with farmers, specifically on the ground on individual farms, we have these benefits. Increasing utilization of farmland, especially I think about old hedgerows and scrubland, things that have been abandoned and more or less are growing back in a mixture of woody vegetation, can be rehabilitated with silvopasture. We can increase the carrying capacity and the stocking. We can actually bring more animals potentially into the landscape once we manage more of our land in grazing systems. We definitely can improve the animal comfort and health, and that can translate to actually improving profit potential. So there has been research to show that shade really brings a lot of benefits to milking animals, to mothering animals, to putting on weight, especially during hot summer months. Shelter in the Northeast in colder climates is also really important in the wintertime to be protected from wind and from snow and things like that. Great use for animals in silvopasture can be in sort of cost-effective vegetation control. And of course, as we've talked about, we can think about on the same acreage, stacking our yields, stacking our different functions. So we've talked about what silvopasture is. Now, what it is not simply putting animals in the woods, okay? This is a really important distinction, and we really want to, from the get-go, kind of insert this caveat that we're most comfortable advocating for silvopasture with ruminants, so with sheep, goats, and cows. And that's partially because we can cultivate and really manage the forage layer more clearly. We know more about that. When we look at pigs and poultry, we're talking about animals that need supplemental grain, and depending on how we manage them and move them, we can do good for the ecosystem, but we can also do a lot of harm. And I would say, in my experience and many other silvopasture practitioners, we mostly see harm being done with animals, especially with pigs, because if they run out of food, they're going to start rooting around and they can do a lot of damage to the forest. So it really comes back to we're managing not just the animal, not just the trees, but also the forages. So if there isn't forage available, if there's no forage available for sheep in this scenario, they're going to do the same thing. They're going to start debarking trees and doing damage. So we have to match the food that's in an available paddock with our animals. And this is a real interesting point of discussion, because if we look at the U.S. Agricultural Census, they ask farmers to, this is done every several years, they ask farmers to define their pasture land and their what they call woodland pasture. So if you look at the numbers in the Northeast and on the East Coast and in the Midwest, you can find anywhere from 15 to 20% of all pasture that's being utilized on farms being defined as woodland pasture. And at the same token, up maybe 2% of folks know the word or identify with silvopasture as the way they're managing that. So there's a huge gap here. What this really means is that most people are putting their animals in the woods. They're not necessarily managing the tree layer to support forage, to get enough light down into the understory, and they're not necessarily managing the forage layer to make sure there's enough food for the animals. They're basically using it as a dumping ground or as an extra place to put those animals when there's no other place to put them. And there's a real danger in that, because we're not stewarding good ecosystems. We're definitely increasing our odds that we're going to do some damage. And this is a cartoon from the Forest Service. Because of this is kind of a common practice with a pretty long history, the U.S. Forest Service was very adamant, and if you come across many foresters today, they'll still really balk at the idea of animals in the woods. And it's because they're really thinking about what they see most often, what they're most familiar with. And what they were taught often in forestry school was you never put livestock in the woods. And you shouldn't put livestock in the woods, but you could manage a silvopasture. So again, it has to be those three layers all together. And in this narrative, we kind of miss some of the main points. One being that we look historically and we say, oh, well, people grazed pigs in woodlands forever. This is a picture from France in the 1400s. But this is a practice called pannage. And pannage is really a practice where pigs were brought into landscapes, but only when there is ample forage available. And this looked most often like acorns and different nuts, masts that would drop to the ground. So these pigs were not left in there all the time, and they're only rotated in seasons and in times of year when this was available. Same with the Spanish Tohaisa, which is a system that's centuries old in parts of Spain and Portugal. Often folks say, well, hey, there's pigs in the woods there, what's going on there? But again, very intensively managed. The pigs are really only brought in when there's ample acorns to harvest as a finishing mechanism. So they're managed off-site somewhere else during the other parts of the year. And actually, the Tohaisa is most often grazed by sheep to maintain it. The merino wool sheep are the most common way that they're managed. So we're really talking about ruminants here. And we're talking about grazing systems. And I'll recommend a couple books. These are two really excellent publications about the practice of grazing, because that's what we're going to be doing with silvopastures. We're going to have to learn a little bit about the, as Sarah Fleck's title really well describes, the art and the science. There is some science, there are some calculations you can do, but there's also an artistic flair to it where you're really just doing a lot of observation. You're building your knowledge base over time of your land, and you're making decisions on a day-to-day basis. And Gene Logston's book, All Flesh is Grass, another excellent read about this idea. So we are going to be grass managers, we're going to be grazing managers, and I think the good news, if you look at the census, is there's lots of people reporting that they do rotational grazing. And so those are folks we can bring into this conversation and say, well, what we really want to aim for are silvopastures, not woodland paddocks. Important with ruminants is to match your forage. This is a graph from a publication from National Center for Appropriate Technology, just showing preferences for intake. This is kind of a generalization. It's going to vary by species and breed, of course, but generally speaking, cattle are much more interested in grasses, less interested in as things get more woody, and goats are kind of the opposite, and sheep are sort of in between. They do a nice balance of the forages. So great potential for all sorts of different animals in these systems to bring into silvopasture. What we're comfortable with saying, I think, is that ruminants are most silvopasture ready. And we don't know a lot about poultry, frankly. There's not a lot of research or good information out there. And pigs are a big question mark. I think they can be done well. I think there's more work that needs to be done. Probably is going to include pasture land that's planted or a supplemental feed in most or all cases. So there's real caution to the wind there with pigs in silvopasture. One thing I came across in researching the book that I think is a really interesting point, and we're not going to dive too deep into it right now, but I just want to mention it, is work from Fred Provenza and folks at Utah State University, which really proposes that animals themselves have innate body wisdom, and they actually want to explore their own environment and seek out their own food. And they want to basically develop a meal throughout the course of a day. They actually have figured out through observation and also scientific research that animals have different preferences, and that goes down to the individual animal and the individual day. And so this image is depicting partially where they learned this from, which is from working with and observing French herders in the Alps. And what they realized is that the herder is not actually just moving animals randomly from one place to the other, but actually really intentionally designing meals for their animals. And so they might look out over this landscape, which they're very familiar with, and really decide, what do we want to start with? What do we want to move on to next? When do we want to give them the really high protein, high quality forage? This is actually, the herder is much more a chef designing the meal than anything else. And while none of us are probably going to be given the opportunity to roam the rural countryside as herders, there's a lot of implications to this work and to this understanding that animals want to explore their environment and they want to develop their own unique diet. And that really gets down to the individual level. So lots of implications. One, for example, is what's called sequencing, which is thinking about the ways in which animals eat different forages in order. There was research done to show tall fescue is a warm season grass, and down in southern states it's often infected with an endophyte. It's a fungus, and that endophyte infected fescue can be consumed by the animals, but it really slows down their digestion. They basically have to deal with that infection as they're processing, so their intake can go down. What folks found is that if cows consume high tannin feed, like in this case they were looking at triticale, which is a forb in the pasture, if they eat that first and then the fescue, they can actually have an increase in their intake because the tannins in that material will sort of offset some of the negative impacts of the endophyte infected fescue. So that order really matters, because what they found is if they eat the fescue first and then the triticale, it doesn't have much of an effect. So this is kind of analogous to what's going on in this scenario, with this kind of idea that ordering can be important. And there's probably lots more questions that we have than answers. But if you dig into Fred Provenza's work, you'll really learn quite a bit about how to manage livestock, how to think about livestock and how they want to interact with the landscape. So triticale is an important medicinal plant really in pasture, and willow is another one that I've been looking at and thinking a lot about because it's high in tannins and is also kind of a medicinal supplement that's available for the animals. So one book that they worked on, Fred and Michael Muret in France, Art and Science of Shepherding, which really names a bunch of these things and helps us think about some of the implications of this practice. So the real benefits to silvopasture for animals would be, as we've talked about, shade and shelter. This is a picture from the Virginia Tech University where they're doing active research on both cattle and sheep, looking at those benefits. This is a honey locust overstory here, and they found that the shade really increases animal comfort, essentially, and also improves their intake and their gains. And so there's some real value there, especially as we head further south and we get into hotter climates. And I'm most excited about fodder. I think there's so much potential to incorporate trees into the landscape as a food for animals. And there's so many different trees we could potentially do, but in my research I found really 4 that really stood out as excellent fodder species. And again, in the third webinar, I'll really dig into these 4 and what we know. Doesn't mean these are the only 4, but these are the ones that actually have some established research around the world, and there's some really interesting stories. So for instance, black locust is essentially equivalent to alfalfa in its nutrition, very high protein feed. Poplar and mulberry, just excellent all-around kind of balanced feeds. Willow, again, high in tannins. And so we have kind of a medicinal benefit. And I see the sheep as they interact on our farm with all these plants really picking and choosing and varying their intake depending on the day and the time of year and all these things. And they really benefit from having these things. So we have to kind of figure out how to get them incorporated more and more as we go. So silvopasture can kind of come from 2 directions. And this picture on the left, Brett, I'll talk more about his farm, but this is from Brett's farm just down the road from me. We can do what's called woodland conversion, where we open up the canopy of a forest sufficiently to let enough light down into the understory so that we can develop forages, whether that's the forages that already will show up from the existing seed bank in the soil, or we might overseed or actually cultivate and put seed down. And then, of course, we can also incorporate trees in pasture, as with this this more mature cherry orchard in England. And so it's kind of 2 different angles. And so in addition to being grass farmers at the end of the day, we're also foresters. We have to kind of learn some of the basics. And this is also a picture from Brett's farm. This is something he's honed in on for many years, and I think is an important thing. The forest goes through a selection process. And in that, we get trees that express their vigor, grow really big. They're going to be the eventual overstory. And we get trees that aren't going to be those. And so the forest essentially thins itself out over time. This is a picture here showing a stump with about a 90-year-old sugar maple here on the base. And that tree cookie on top is a 90-year-old sugar maple that was growing just a few feet away. So both trees of the same species, same environmental characteristics, very, very drastically different in terms of their outcomes. And so as foresters, whether we're amateur or professional, we have to pay attention to these dynamics, and this leads us to understand that we can thin some of those suppressed trees, those ones that aren't going to do as well, and leave the bigger ones for future timber harvest or just to be there for the long term. And in this process of selection on like an acre of forest, we might get the end canopy being 100 trees from an initial seed bank of 100,000 seeds, and we might get 1,000 seedlings along the way that kind of sort themselves out. So when we do this, we have to engage and really learn. We have to understand. These are some students in a class that we ran on our farm really trying to do some assessing of trees and understand where we're at. How old is this stand? How is the health of these trees? How appropriate is this species for the soil that it's growing on? And then, what management decisions do we want to make from that? And that becomes a big part of the process. Really recommend this book by Chris Mazer as a great introductory text. The Redesign Forest talks about a lot of these patterns and dynamics, and it's just a great read as you go. So when we plant trees, we also want to mimic that idea that thousands and thousands of seeds become hundreds and hundreds of trees. And I see a lot of landowners, and I used to do it myself, say, well, I'm going to buy these trees. I'm going to look at their finished spacing. I'm going to plant them, 40 feet apart or 60 feet apart. That's really not how a forest develops. And if we're going to plant trees, it's really betting against the odds. So we've really taken up the practice, if we're going to plant, is to plant densely. We often plant in rows or clusters because it's easier than with individual trees at wide spacing to fence them off from the sheep while they're getting established. So here's a row of black locust we planted in 2013, 3 foot apart spacing. And now this is just last year. They're over 25 feet tall. And at this point, we've encouraged them to grow nice and straight. They have good stems. We can go in here and start to make some initial selections. We are removing some of these trees, the less vigorous ones, the ones that aren't likely to live as long. We can use those rot-resistant poles for lots of different things. So a lot of what we're using them for are tree stakes to stake and plant more trees. We can cut some of these down to the ground and let them coppice and resprout, and we can feed that as fodder to the animals. So there's no loss here. It just gives us a lot of options. And if for some reason we had a low success rate with our seedlings, like we lost 20%, we'd still have a good stand here to work with. So planting densely and then thinning is a really good strategy, I think, in silvopasture. While we might be starting out this way, this is mimicking more what a forest does. It puts a lot of eggs out in the basket and then sorts itself out. We might ultimately be looking at spacing that some people often think of as savanna. And savanna is a tricky word in its relation to silvopasture, because savanna can be trees that are incredibly widely spaced. They could be hundreds of feet apart to trees that are just 20 feet apart, right? But the idea of the savanna is that trees are widely spaced enough so that grasses and forages underneath can be maintained. So while this is the image that often people see of kind of evenly spaced trees throughout the landscape, it doesn't have to look this way, and it doesn't always mean it's appropriate. And especially if you're doing forest management, this is, again, Brett's farm, he's making selections on his trees based on his individual goals and what the site dictates. And this is very unlikely and possibly impossible for it to result in every tree being exactly the same amount apart. We're not going to usually thin our woods for silvopasture and have an evenly spaced trees. We'll have some wider spacing, some in little clusters and closer spacing. It'll be a mosaic of different patterns in the landscape. So lastly, before I turn things over to Brett, what this all comes down to, and the book in chapter 6 gets into this, is a bit of a planning process. And we all need to become sort of amateur foresters and grass managers in this, but we also probably will work with folks who have more experience. But the book talks about a basic process where we walk through a landscape, and this is just an example on the land that we are managing, where we do a basic forest stand map. Basically, we identify different patches of woody vegetation that differ from each other based on the dominant vegetation, the types of trees that are there, the hydrology, the soil, the slope, any of those things, and also how we want to manage them. And so by dividing these up, we kind of get some different blocks and different things that we want to think about managing in very different ways. We match that with what's called pasture scoring. And so in the areas that are open, we might do an assessment to look at and rank our pastures and identify areas that are excellent, good, or poor, right? And so in total, we get this kind of mixture where we recognize that forest stands and woody vegetation have management objectives and needs, and then some of our pasture might be considered really good, and some might need more renovation, more work going on. These kind of assessments are really important. This is all just what is there right now. This is the first part of the process. Then we really look to, well, what could be, and how are we going to manage this? And so these are not our paddock designs. This is not how we're going to rotate the animals. We're not going to go from A to D to E to that little green patch to the orange one. This is an assessment map. So we also go through a process of developing a grazing plan and figuring out, for the number of animals that we have, how many paddocks we can support, what size those paddocks should generally be, and we map that out as well. And so these aren't the same things. You can see here, if I overlap those colored assessment bubbles with my paddocks, that each of these paddocks, pretty much all these paddocks, have multiple assessments in them, and that's a good thing. We want to design our paddocks so they have a little bit of forest, a little bit of open pasture, and they have kind of mixed composition in what they find. And so this process really helps us work through, the areas that we really want to focus on first. There's no way I'm going to, in 1 year, transition this entire 40-acre farm into the grazing paradise that I imagine, but I can identify through this assessment process areas that might need the most help, like number 25 in there, or something that has a little bit of good pasture, has a little forest edge, but pretty weak pasture composition overall. That might be a place I put my energy first, versus something like paddock 22, which has some forest edge and also some really good pasture establishment. So ultimately, what we look for is a mosaic of habitat. We're not looking for uniformity in silvopasture. We're looking for a mixture of all these things as we go.